The gatekeeper. It was a radiant morning in San Francisco, the kind that kissed the glass of skyscrapers and sparkled on the Golden Gate. A luxury black sedan slid quietly into the private entrance of the Moscone Center, one of the largest and most prestigious tech venues in the world. Inside that car sat Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet Incorporated, lost in thought. Today was no ordinary day. It was the Global Tech for Humanity Summit, an event Sundar had not only helped to envision, but had painstakingly shaped over the past year. The theme was Technology with Heart. Thousands were attending: developers, engineers, policymakers, activists, and students. Keynote speakers from all over the world had gathered to discuss how technology could elevate human lives, not just economies. But as Sundar stepped out of his car, dressed simply in a navy blazer and slacks, with no entourage or badge, he was about to face a moment he never anticipated, one that would challenge not just his authority, but his humility. At the security gate stood a tall, no-nonsense security guard named Marcus. Middle-aged, with graying hair and the kind of presence that demanded attention, Marcus took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously. Sundar smiled gently and offered a polite, "Good morning." Marcus, flipping through a clipboard and scanning a tablet, glanced up. "Badge, sir?" Sundar reached into his coat and frowned. No badge. He had been reviewing his speech in the car and had left his ID on the dashboard. "Ah, I must have left it in the car," he said calmly. "But I'm—" Marcus held up a hand. "Sir, no badge, no entry." Sundar blinked. "I understand, but I'm Sundar Pichai." Marcus didn't flinch. "That name doesn't mean anything without credentials. I've got strict instructions. I'm one of the keynote speakers. In fact, I'm hosting the summit. Everyone says they're someone. You'd be surprised how many Elon Musks I've met this morning." Marcus folded his arms. "No badge. Step aside, please." Sundar paused. He could have gotten irritated. He could have name-dropped or made a call. But something in Marcus's resolve stopped him. There was no arrogance in the man's voice, only commitment. He nodded slowly. "All right. May I ask your name?" "Marcus Walker. And you are?" "Still calm," Sundar replied. "Still Sundar." Marcus cracked a rare smile, then returned to scanning the list. Instead of calling for help, Sundar did something unexpected. He stepped aside, sat on a nearby bench, and began observing the other guests. Young developers walked by nervously rehearsing pitches. Old professors shuffled in, holding rolled-up presentation charts. Volunteers dashed about, fixing banners and cables. He watched, unnoticed. For the first time in years, Sundar Pichai felt invisible. And strangely, it was a gift. A glimpse into the past. As he waited, Sundar's mind wandered back to his roots. He was born in Chennai, India, in a modest two-room apartment. His father was an electrical engineer, and his mother a stenographer. Their home had no telephone. When Sundar was 12, his father brought home a rotary phone, the family's first. That moment sparked a fascination. He remembered running his fingers along the dial, curious about how the voice could travel through wires. That phone changed everything. It made the world feel closer. Years later, he would lead one of the world's largest tech companies, designing devices that connected billions. But today, standing humbly outside an event he created, he realized the importance of not being recognized. He watched Marcus again. The man hadn't taken a single coffee break. His eyes scanned every visitor with the precision of a machine, but there was kindness in his stern demeanor. Sundar saw something many others missed: dignity in duty. The call that never came. Back at the gate, a volunteer finally noticed Sundar. A college intern named Maya, rushing with her tablet, froze. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God, you're—" Sundar raised a finger to his lips. "Let's not make a scene. Can you fetch my assistant? I left my badge in the car." Maya nodded and disappeared. Meanwhile, Marcus turned, curious. She know you. Sundar smiled. Apparently. Marcus scratched his head. You really Sundar Pichai? Sundar stood and extended a hand. Yes, but I'm also just a guy who forgot his badge. Marcus shook his hand, still in disbelief. Well, I'll be. Sundar's assistant arrived moments later, breathless, waving the missing badge. Mr. Pichai, we were wondering where you. It's all right, Sundar said, with a glance at Marcus. Everything's in good hands. What happens next? The incident didn't end there. Sundar insisted that Marcus be brought in as a guest for the summit. Not as security. As an honored observer. At first, Marcus resisted. I'm just a guard. No one is just anything. Sundar replied. You stood your ground, not because you didn't recognize me, but because you respected your role. That's leadership. Marcus, in his pressed uniform, walked into the summit hall that day like a man stepping into a world he'd only watched from afar. He sat in the front row as Sundar took the stage and began his keynote with an unexpected story. This morning, I was stopped from entering my own event. I met a man who reminded me that roles don't define our worth. Character does. The man who carried the gate. Later that evening, the applause still echoed faintly in the corridors of the Moscone Center. Sundar Pichai had delivered one of his most powerful and human-centric keynotes to date, one that had nothing to do with breakthrough devices or revolutionary software. Instead, it revolved around a simple human interaction, being denied entry by a man doing his job. It wasn't the innovation people remembered that day. It was the story of Marcus Walker, the security guard who saw responsibility before reputation. While most VIPs had retreated to private lounges for champagne receptions and strategic networking, Sundar quietly slipped away to a smaller room adjacent to the main stage. It was one of the community roundtables, an initiative he had personally championed. The idea was to bring together tech leaders with everyday workers, janitors, drivers, cafeteria staff, maintenance engineers, for honest, unscripted conversations about the real-world effects of technology. For the first time in years, the voices in these rooms weren't filtered through corporate jargon or polished presentations. They were raw, grounded, and sometimes uncomfortable. And that was precisely the point. Sundar walked in and immediately noticed Marcus seated near the back, still in uniform, looking somewhat out of place. His hands were folded tightly, a water bottle untouched at his side. Around him sat a variety of other support staff, an elderly woman who had been cleaning offices at the center for over a decade, a young man who managed late-night parking, a cafeteria worker with tired eyes, but a bright smile. No media, no cameras, just people. Sundar took a seat beside Marcus without fanfare. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then, the janitor, her name was Gloria, broke the silence with a quiet but firm voice. You know, they always talk about the future of work, but nobody asks us if we'll have a place in it. Heads nodded around the table. I'm learning how to use apps just to keep up, said the cafeteria worker, whose name tag read Louis. Our schedules, our pay stubs, even our shifts, everything's gone digital. It's faster, but it also feels like we're disappearing. Marcus added thoughtfully, sometimes it feels like the more advanced the world gets, the less we see the people in it. The room went still at that. Sundar listened closely, not to prepare a response, but to understand. Here he was, the architect of systems used by billions, facing the honest truth that the very platforms he helped pioneer were outpacing the ability of many to adapt. It wasn't enough to build efficient products. They had to be equitable, human-centered, empowering, not just to shareholders or headline makers, but to the silent majority that moved the machinery of the world in the background. He turned to Marcus. What you said about the people disappearing, that struck me. You're not the first to say it, but you said it without blame. Just observation. Marcus leaned back, letting out a soft breath. I've worked security for 27 years. Airports, corporate buildings, universities, seen a lot of people walk by. CEOs, celebrities, senators. And I'll tell you, when you're invisible, you notice everything. You learn who nods, who smiles, who walks past like your furniture. Today, you sat down. That's rare. It wasn't a compliment. It was a revelation. Sundar felt the weight of it. He thought about all the handshakes and keynote lights and polished green rooms, and how far they could sometimes pull someone from the truth. Not out of arrogance, but simply through momentum. Even the best-intentioned leaders could lose sight of the people who weren't in the spotlight, who weren't on LinkedIn or Twitter, who didn't post TED Talks or get profiled in Forbes. Sundar cleared his throat. "Do you know what inspired me to go into technology?" he asked, turning to the group. It was a rotary phone. My father brought one home when I was a kid, and I was mesmerized by how voices travel through wires. I used to imagine entire worlds behind those static-filled rings. It made me curious, hopeful. But now, decades later, I wonder, how many people feel left out of that magic? Technology was supposed to include, not isolate. Lewis smiled. Then maybe it's time we get behind the wires too. That single sentence stayed with Sundar long after the discussion ended. Later that night, an unexpected visit. After the summit wound down, and the last of the cleanup crews began folding chairs and rolling up carpets, Sundar requested to walk the venue one last time. Not as a CEO checking final details, but as someone searching for clarity. The halls were quiet, still dimly lit by the soft yellow glow of emergency lights. It was here he encountered Marcus again, this time by the service elevator near the loading dock. "Still here?" Marcus asked, surprised. "I could ask you the same." Marcus grinned. "Old habits. I like to make sure everything's secure." Sundar nodded. "Mind if I walk with you?" They walked together in silence, the kind shared between people who understand something deeper than words. Down the quiet corridor, past the place where Sundar had earlier been turned away. A memory that now felt surreal. "I never asked," Sundar said eventually. "What made you hold your ground this morning? You could have let me through with a bit of pressure." Marcus slowed his pace. "You ever hear the story of the watchman who fell asleep at the gate?" "No." "Well, it's not much of a story, but my father told it to me often. He said, a man can fail at many things, but if he fails at his post, he fails the trust placed in him." That always stuck. People think security's just about standing around, but for me, it's about carrying trust. Sundar stared ahead. In a world obsessed with innovation, that kind of steadfast loyalty to duty was itself a kind of miracle. A reminder that leadership wasn't always about who made the most noise or held the biggest title. Sometimes, the real leaders were the ones who simply showed up, every day, without asking for recognition. They reached the doors leading out to the quiet street. The city buzzed faintly in the distance. "Marcus," Sundar said before parting, "how would you feel about doing a fireside chat next month with me? No cameras, just staff at HQ. People need to hear your story." Marcus chuckled. "You want me to speak to your engineers. I want you to speak to leaders, present and future." There was a long pause, then a nod. "All right," Marcus said, "but only if they show up on time." Seeds of change. Back in Mountain View a week later, Sundar sat at his desk drafting a new initiative. Not a product launch, not a market expansion, but a company-wide program he titled Behind the Gate. Its goal was simple yet radical. Every senior executive and product team member would be required to shadow roles considered non-strategic, security, janitorial, cafeteria, for at least 1 week a year. Not as observers, but as participants. No badges, no titles. Just people stepping into someone else's shoes. And at the center of the initiative was the story of a gate. A gate not just of metal and rules, but of perspective, and the man who carried it without ever asking to be seen. Echoes in the halls of power. The idea began as a whisper, A memo quietly circulated across senior departments, marked not urgent but required. No announcement at an all-hands, no PR campaign, no executive briefing posted to LinkedIn. Just a single internal email signed by Sundar Pichai himself, with the subject line, "Behind the Gate, Reimagining Leadership." Attached was a document outlining a deceptively simple directive. Every Google executive, director, senior manager, and team lead was to spend 1 full week over the next quarter working in a support role, shadowing or directly contributing to one of the many functions that kept the company running behind the scenes. The cafeteria line, the janitorial team, the transportation crew, security detail, data center maintenance, facilities operations. These weren't volunteer opportunities or symbolic gestures. They were, as Sundar wrote, acts of reintegration with the roots of the machine. The immediate reaction varied. Some read the email with a sense of cautious curiosity. A few embraced it with genuine interest, seeing it as an opportunity for introspection. But for many, it landed with a mixture of disbelief, discomfort, and in certain circles, barely concealed resentment. Quiet murmurs rose among directors of engineering and VPs of product who, despite their respectful tone, were clearly troubled. Time, after all, was the most precious commodity. And the calendar of a tech leader was not a flexible canvas. It was a crowded battlefield of priorities, deadlines, board meetings, and investor calls. Some thought it was a symbolic stunt. Others worried it was a reactionary move following Sundar's keynote at the summit. A few simply felt insulted. "I didn't spend 20 years building search algorithms to mop floors," one senior engineer muttered in frustration to a colleague. This isn't how transformation works. But Sundar didn't respond to the noise. He didn't need to. He had already taken the first step himself. In the third week of the program rollout, Sundar arrived at the Mountain View campus at 6:00 a.m., not through the executive entrance, but from the side-loading dock. Wearing gray coveralls, a reflective vest, and a plain white cap, he joined the early morning facilities crew responsible for preparing the complex for the day. He spent his time sweeping hallways, restocking soap dispensers, adjusting air filters, and helping fix a persistent plumbing issue in one of the older buildings. To those who didn't recognize him, he was just another early hire on the facilities team. To those who did, the image of the CEO on his knees beside an open pipe wasn't just striking, it was confounding. What did it mean when the most powerful figure in a trillion-dollar company chose to walk barefoot into the boiler room of the very institution he led? Word spread quickly. Photos were strictly prohibited, but stories weren't. Employees whispered about Sundar joking with custodians, helping lift crates in the cafeteria, shadowing an overnight security patrol. Even in silence, the message was louder than any keynote. No role is beneath dignity, and no leader is above understanding. As the weeks went by, other leaders followed suit, reluctantly at first, then gradually with curiosity. The head of AI research spent her assigned week working in food services, learning how cafeteria menus were planned to balance health, diversity, and cost efficiency. A director of cloud infrastructure shadowed the mailroom logistics crew, realizing for the first time how internal communication was often delayed not by code, but by physical routing inefficiencies. A UX designer on the Pixel team spent a week at a customer service call center, answering real complaints from real people in real time. It wasn't glamorous, it was exhausting, and it was deeply revealing. The walls of the company, walls of hierarchy, of specialization, of invisible class, began to show faint cracks. But not everyone adapted easily. Resistance from within. One Monday afternoon, 2 months into the initiative, a scheduled executive review was abruptly postponed. The VP responsible had missed his shuttle, an unplanned side effect of the fact that he'd been working nights with the parking operations team. In a different era, that might have led to stern conversations about focus and priorities. But now, under the new culture Sundar was cultivating, it prompted a very different internal conversation. Why was one of the highest-paid employees forced to rely on shuttle schedules that didn't even align with his temporary role? Why hadn't anyone noticed the disconnect before? But for all its noble intentions, the Behind the Gate initiative also uncovered more painful truths. An anonymous internal blog post began circulating, written by a member of the janitorial crew. It detailed the experiences of a week shadowed by a senior manager who, despite their participation, offered no conversation, no questions, and spent most of the time on their phone. The post ended with a line that cut through the company like a thunderclap. "We are not exhibits in a museum of humility." The response was immediate and intense. Some called for better training before executives joined shadowing sessions. Others argued the entire program needed reevaluation. A small but vocal group suggested canceling it altogether. But Sundar, true to form, didn't rush to react. Instead, he called for something else, a listening circle. In a large, undecorated conference room, support staff and executives gathered in equal number. No presentations, no rankings, no introductions beyond first names, just people sitting in a circle, telling stories of work, exhaustion, gratitude, and misunderstanding. One security guard spoke of how dehumanizing it felt to scan badges for people who wouldn't look up. A facilities worker described the personal pride he took in making the hallways shine, even when no one noticed. One executive tearfully admitted that her week in housekeeping had exposed a blindness she never realized she carried, that she had walked past the same woman cleaning her floor every day for 7 years and never once asked her name. In that moment, the program was reborn, not as a mandate from above, but as a cultural mirror. Not everyone would be transformed. Not every week would be graceful. But the illusion that the company could exist as two separate worlds, builders and maintainers, thinkers and doers, innovators and laborers, had been broken. The voice that carried. At the heart of this transformation was Marcus Walker. He had declined interviews, ignored the media requests, and refused offers to monetize his unexpected fame. He still showed up early, clocked in, wore his badge with pride. But within the company, his story became a quiet lodestar, a symbol of what happens when you do your job not for credit, but because you believe in the responsibility it carries. Sundar invited him to speak not at the company's main conference or in front of shareholders, but at a small retreat for emerging team leads. There, Marcus didn't speak of gates or badges or mistaken identities. He spoke about choices, about what it meant to choose integrity when no one was watching, about staying consistent in a world obsessed with disruption. His words didn't sound like a lecture. They felt like an invitation. "You all build things that change the world," Marcus said slowly. "But maybe the most important thing you'll ever build is a habit of paying attention. To people, to places, to the weight your decisions carry even when you can't see the person holding the other end of them." It wasn't poetic. It wasn't slick. But in that room, not a single person checked their phone. The fire outside the gate. By the beginning of the third quarter, what had started as an internal cultural experiment at Google had erupted into a full-blown media narrative. At first, the story had been whispered through tech forums and low-profile blogs, the kind that existed on the quiet fringes of mainstream tech journalism. Articles carried titles like "CEO Cleans Toilets," "Sparks Culture Reset," and "Google's New Empathy Initiative," gimmick or gold. The tone was, at first, cautiously intrigued. But once a high-profile tech journalist for The Atlantic published an in-depth piece entitled "The Man Who Locked Out a Giant," chronicling Marcus Walker's role in catalyzing the movement, the story exploded into global discourse. In days, every major media outlet scrambled for their take. Business magazines interviewed behavioral economists. Social justice podcasts weighed in on the class symbolism. Tech influencers began creating reaction videos and think pieces, parsing every word of Sundar Pichai's internal memos as if they were sacred texts. Even late-night talk shows found punchlines in the notion of CEOs scrubbing cafeteria trays and running parking shuttles. What had been intended as a quiet rehumanization initiative inside the company had now become a full-blown symbol of something much larger. The confrontation between elite leadership and everyday labor in the age of automation and abstraction. And with the attention came backlash. Critics from within the business world accused Sundar of staging a soft populist performance to shield Google from deeper scrutiny. Some financial analysts warned that executives stepping away from critical strategic duties could damage quarterly goals. One scathing editorial in the Wall Street Review called the program a distraction soaked in virtue signaling, comparing it to a medieval king taking off his crown to till the fields, only to wear it again and make policy the next day. Empathy doesn't replace execution, the columnist wrote pointedly. And performance doesn't arise from pity. What Google needs is laser focus, not public theater. In Silicon Valley, opinions fractured. Some tech leaders praised the initiative as visionary, privately admitting they had adopted similar internal programs in the wake of its visibility. Others scoffed, arguing that it set a dangerous precedent, signaling vulnerability at a time when confidence was currency. At an exclusive venture capital summit in Palo Alto, Sundar was quietly disinvited from a panel on executive foresight. The message was unspoken but clear. Disruption was welcome. Humility, less so. Back at Google, the noise outside began to seep in. Executives who had once agreed to participate in the behind-the-gate weeks now asked for postponements, citing pressing deadlines or travel. HR teams were overwhelmed with requests for clarification on performance tracking during these immersive weeks. A few key engineers left the company, citing concerns over mission drift and identity confusion. Even internally, some staff began to express cynicism, wondering whether the initiative was an overcorrection that distracted from innovation and blurred the clarity of roles. But Sundar did not flinch. Instead, he convened a closed-door session, not with his board, not with PR, but with a group of support staff, engineers, and mid-level managers. In that room, with no slides, no agenda, and no polished speech, he addressed the growing storm. I've heard everything, from admiration to mockery, and I don't blame either side. When something this unusual enters a system used to hierarchy and insulation, it's natural for antibodies to form. But this was never meant to impress anyone outside. It wasn't designed to be a brand. It was meant to repair something we didn't know had broken. He paused, not for effect, but from genuine reflection. When I started this journey, it wasn't because of a PR goal. It was because one morning, a man doing his job stopped me from bypassing a system we built, and in doing so, he reminded me what leadership is really about. Not speed, not influence, but integrity. The room was silent. Then someone asked a question, almost hesitantly. But what if we're forced to abandon the program? If the backlash grows stronger? If shareholders get nervous? Sundar looked directly at the young woman who had asked. His voice was steady. Then at least we will have done something real. Not scalable, not repeatable, but human. Marcus at the crossroads. While Sundar managed the storm from within the fortress of Mountain View, Marcus Walker was facing an entirely different challenge, one he had never prepared for. After his name had gone public, Marcus received a flood of attention. Interview requests, brand offers, book deals, even a proposed miniseries dramatizing the incident at the gate. Companies wanted him to endorse security training programs. One entertainment agency proposed a documentary about the world's most honest gatekeeper. The attention bewildered and unnerved him. He declined all of it. He wasn't interested in being a symbol, and he certainly didn't want to be famous. Marcus had lived his life by rules. Clear, quiet, dependable rules. Show up early. Do your job well. Don't ask for attention. Don't lose sight of the line between duty and ego. But now, that line was beginning to blur. Strangers began to show up at his home in Oakland. A man waited by his car one evening just to thank him for inspiring his son. A woman mailed a painting of a gate with Marcus's name carved into it. While these gestures were kind, they also unsettled him. Marcus felt something slipping. His anonymity, his peace, his grounding. So one night, he drove to the city alone, parked by the edge of Golden Gate Park, and simply sat in his car for hours, watching the fog roll in. He thought about his late wife, Julia, and the many nights they'd sat like this, her hand in his, the radio softly playing jazz, no words needed. He thought about his son, a teacher in Fresno, who had called that week with pride in his voice. "You're a good man, Dad," he had said. "I always knew it. Now the world does too." And yet Marcus didn't want the world to know. He didn't want to be a name. He just wanted to be enough. For himself, for those he served, and for the job he had always held sacred. A decision at dawn. The next morning, Marcus requested a private meeting with Sundar. No assistants. No agenda. They met in a quiet courtyard on campus, just after sunrise. The air was crisp, and dew clung to the glass surfaces like tiny truths refusing to evaporate. "I need to step back," Marcus said after a long silence. "From the speaking requests, the stories, even from the campus, maybe for a while." Sundar nodded slowly, not surprised. "I never wanted this attention," Marcus continued. "I wanted to do my job. I still want to. But lately, I feel like a mascot. And mascots can't do security." Sundar responded with the same calm gravity that had defined his approach all along. "Then take the time you need. But remember, what you did wasn't about a moment. It was about reminding us all what we've forgotten. If you ever want to walk back through that gate, it'll be open. Not because of who you became, but because of who you already were." Marcus looked down, then up. "And if I don't come back?" Sundar smiled gently. "Then you'll have still changed everything." They shook hands, two men who had started their morning on opposite sides of a badge scanner, and now stood together. Leader and gatekeeper, neither above the other. The unseen algorithm. By the time autumn settled over Silicon Valley, the effects of Behind the Gate were no longer confined to the company Sundar Pichai led. What had begun as an intimate, human-centered experiment meant only to bridge the invisible chasm between tech leadership and essential workers, was now cascading through the industry in unpredictable ways. At first it moved through whispers, through dinner conversations at leadership retreats, and then emerged publicly in ways that could not be controlled or commodified. It was in the design meetings at an upstart AI firm in Berlin where a CTO abruptly canceled the day's agenda to spend an afternoon helping clean the office kitchen. It was in a robotics lab in Kyoto, where graduate students who once only spoke to their professors through charts and data were now required to spend 3 weeks working with the janitorial staff of the university. It was in a Tel Aviv cybersecurity startup, where the CEO quietly announced that their leadership team would rotate into customer service roles monthly, not for optics, but to remember the friction we claim to solve. What startled analysts was not the initiative's spread, but its unofficialness. No licensing. No organizational body. No standardized kit, or TED talk or LinkedIn blueprint. It was as if the story had evolved beyond policy, into myth. And like most myths, it had begun to belong to everyone, not just the one who first lived it. The image of a man standing at a gate, not with arrogance, but with integrity, was now painted onto the walls of co-working spaces in Chile and pasted onto employee welcome kits in Singapore. Some called it the gatekeeper principle. Others simply called it the Marcus method. In rural schools and coding boot camps, instructors began using the story as a way to teach not only ethics but dignity, a word rarely mentioned in tech circles, but suddenly gaining currency again. But not everyone was comfortable with the legacy that was taking shape. In corporate headquarters across the globe, executives began whispering of the Marcus problem, a term coined within the strategy wing of a multinational consulting firm to describe the cultural inertia created when symbolic humility starts interfering with aggressive quarterly scaling models. The problem wasn't that executives were being asked to do labor beneath their pay grade. It was that empathy had become infectious, and empathy, in its rawest form, disrupted efficiency models. This concern came to a head when, during a major global tech summit in Geneva, several CEOs were asked to publicly endorse or reject Sundar's philosophy. Some dodged. Some rebranded it with their own gloss. One very prominent tech founder, known for his disruptive swagger, dismissed it entirely. "Look, tech isn't about feelings," he said on stage, with the usual charismatic smirk that drew applause from certain corners of the crowd. "It's about velocity. If we all slowed down to fold napkins or fix pipes, we wouldn't be colonizing Mars. We'd be fixing coffee machines." The audience laughed, but Sundar, watching from a quiet room halfway across the world, did not. Not out of offense, but because he recognized something deeper, the fear in that laughter. The fear that the system, once questioned, might not survive the answers. The fear that leaders, once humanized, might become accountable not just to results but to relationships. A conversation with consequences. Back in Mountain View, Google's board had requested a closed strategic session with Sundar. The meeting was not antagonistic, but it was not friendly either. It was analytical, calm, unemotional, but laced with the subtle tension of unspoken doubt. The central question was not about ethics, but about sustainability. Could a company of such global scale continue to function efficiently if leadership was spending an increasing amount of time on tasks that, by traditional metrics, were non-core? Could culture be quantified when it didn't produce immediately measurable productivity gains? Sundar sat at the long oak table, surrounded by minds as sharp as his own, men and women who had once cheered his ascent to the CEO role, who had watched him steer the company through antitrust storms, regulatory battles, and the shifting sands of AI evolution. But now, their eyes carried a kind of soft suspicion, not of betrayal, but of misalignment, like a seasoned pilot veering slightly off the expected route, not far, but far enough to make the tower nervous. One board member leaned forward. "Sundar, you've done remarkable work reframing the soul of this company. But at what point do we ask, does soul interfere with scale?" Sundar didn't rush to answer. He closed his eyes briefly, drawing from a deeper well than strategy. When we forget soul, scale becomes machinery, and machinery breaks people. There was a long pause. "Machines don't resist unethical orders," he added quietly. "People do, but only if they've remembered their own value." The room didn't erupt into applause. There was no nodding core of agreement, just silence. And in that silence, the future of not just a company, but an entire philosophy of leadership sat precariously on a wire strung between logic and conscience. Marcus in silence. Far from the corporate towers and media frenzy, Marcus Walker had returned to something closer to his original life. He had taken a quiet consulting role with a local nonprofit in Oakland that worked with at-risk youth, helping teach basic job readiness skills and, ironically, situational awareness for security positions. He kept no social media presence, refused interviews, rarely discussed his time at Google. The man who had accidentally become the moral compass of a trillion-dollar empire now spent his days teaching young men how to maintain eye contact, how to de-escalate conflict, how to carry themselves not with fear or aggression, but with quiet certainty. One day, while walking to the BART station, a young boy stopped him. "Are you the guy from the internet?" the boy asked, squinting up at him. Marcus chuckled. "I don't know. I've been on the sidewalk more than the internet." "But you're the gate guy, right?" Marcus paused. He looked down at the boy, no more than 10 years old, skinny, with big eyes, and a cracked phone in his hand. "Yeah," Marcus said finally. "I'm the gate guy." The boy grinned. "My teacher said you didn't let the boss in." Marcus laughed this time, not because it was funny, but because it reminded him of the beautiful simplicity with which children interpret the world. "That's about right," he said. "Why?" Marcus knelt to the boy's level. "Because the rules matter. And the people behind the rules matter even more." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but satisfied. And as he ran off, Marcus felt a strange peace settle over him. Not pride, not fame, just the rare stillness of having chosen, in a world of compromise, to do something exactly right. A quiet revolution. In the months that followed, Sundar made no grand speeches. He did not defend the program publicly or weaponize it for brand glory. Instead, he chose to keep walking the campus, sitting in rooms he wasn't expected to enter, learning stories he didn't need to know to do his job, but that made him do it better. Slowly, other companies adopted similar models, not because they were told to, but because their people demanded it. Culture, after all, is not taught through slide decks. It is absorbed through example. The gate, in all its metaphoric weight, had been opened, and the world was walking through it, one step at a time. The storm protocol. It began not with an explosion, nor a grand public failure, but with silence, precisely the kind of silence that unsettles engineers and excites opportunists. One mid-December afternoon, a routine data audit in Google's Zurich data center triggered an anomaly alert. It wasn't flagged immediately. Most anomaly alerts are harmless. A spike in server load here, a lag in authentication response there. But when the incident response team escalated the issue, it became clear this wasn't a hiccup. It was a breach, sophisticated, coordinated, and unfolding across 3 international data centers almost simultaneously. Before protocols could fully contain it, a series of cascading system failures rippled through core infrastructure, causing temporary blackouts across several services: Gmail, Google Cloud Platform, and parts of Android's authentication services. Though the technical team mobilized rapidly and full service was restored in just under 6 hours, the damage extended beyond lost connectivity. Sensitive data had been skimmed, not leaked in full, but observed, patterned, mapped, and in some cases, redirected. The infiltration was surgical and chilling, and it had all happened during a time when much of the senior leadership, encouraged by Sundar's behind-the-gate model, had been embedded in field immersion weeks. Some of the most critical decision-makers were unavailable in real time. A VP who had been working on a night shift with the transportation crew in Austin was unreachable for 4 hours. A security strategist was with the cafeteria team in Hyderabad, far from crisis infrastructure. What followed was a storm, not just of headlines or public outrage, but of internal reckoning. For the first time, the principle of empathy-based leadership was being confronted by the harshest of metrics: security response time, performance accountability. External critics who had been circling like sharks now dove in, with sharp-toothed editorials branding Sundar's initiative as a moral indulgence. A renowned venture capitalist wrote a venomous blog titled "Gates Don't Protect Data," accusing Sundar of blurring lines between heart and hardware to dangerous effect. One international newspaper ran a front-page story headlined, "When Compassion Slows the Cloud." Internally, fear simmered. Engineers who had quietly supported the cultural shift now began questioning its practicality. Managers whispered that while immersion weeks were admirable in theory, they had inadvertently created vulnerability in the system's most urgent moments. The board summoned Sundar to a confidential strategic council session. There was no anger in the room, just an uncomfortable clarity, like the quiet after an engine stalls mid-flight. Sundar stood at the head of the table, unshaken in posture but weathered in spirit. He had expected this moment. In fact, a part of him had always known it would come. No revolution escapes consequence. No value-driven shift goes unchallenged by reality. He let the room breathe before he began. "I will not pretend this wasn't serious," he said, his voice measured. "I will not claim the breach had nothing to do with our immersion weeks. Some protocols lagged. Some links were weaker. But I also won't accept the narrative that empathy and security are incompatible. If anything, this breach revealed what we should have seen earlier. Our systems are technologically advanced, but culturally siloed." He leaned forward, his voice gaining edge. "We have built engineering brilliance around code, but have neglected the culture required to make that code sustainable. What this breach exposed was not a failure of empathy. It exposed that we have not gone far enough. Our field roles were not integrated into real-time decision chains. Our crisis protocols weren't inclusive of decentralized participation. We didn't trust our non-core staff to be part of the response, even though many had more operational visibility than our architects. That's not empathy's failure. That's leadership inertia. There was a silence that followed, not of resistance, but of contemplation. Even the most skeptical board members understood the gravity of his argument. The breach hadn't happened because of empathy. It had happened because empathy had yet to be operationalized. And now, the challenge was no longer philosophical. It was architectural. Marcus returns. Far from this boardroom reckoning, Marcus Walker had remained blissfully unaware of the cyber breach until the third day after the incident. He had been mentoring youth at a community center in East Oakland, where internet outages were common and trust in tech companies had long worn thin. When he finally did hear the news, it came not through an alert or a press release, but through a call from an old friend, Louis, the cafeteria manager from Google who had remained a close contact even after Marcus stepped away. "You know they're in a storm, right?" Louis said. "They're saying the empathy thing caused it." Marcus was silent for a moment. "It wasn't the empathy," he replied. "It was the structure." Louis paused. "They might need your voice again." Marcus exhaled slowly. "They don't need a symbol. They need a plan." That night, Marcus didn't sleep, not out of worry, but out of memory. He remembered how deeply Sundar had listened during those early roundtables, how he had sat beside support staff with no agenda, no camera, no filters, how he had seen value in janitors and drivers and guards, not just as people worthy of recognition, but as people worthy of trust. And trust, Marcus knew, was not a feeling. It was a system. The next morning, Marcus drafted a quiet letter, not to Sundar directly, but to a group of department leads he had once encountered during his immersion shadowing. In it, he proposed what he called the second layer framework, a model for embedding support staff into emergency protocols not as backup, but as first contact observers. He pointed out that the breach was first flagged by a junior server maintenance employee who didn't have clearance to escalate it directly. He noted how shuttle drivers knew when systems were down by the patterns of people's arrival and departure. He cited how cleaning crews had observed suspicious hardware weeks before it had flagged it. The insights were not grandiose, but they were revelatory. When Sundar read the letter, forwarded to him via a director of operations, he didn't hesitate. He asked Marcus to join a newly formed task force called Protocol from the Ground. It wouldn't be publicized. It wouldn't be flashy. It would be a rebuilding team, composed of engineers, ethics advisors, and, for the first time in Google's history, staff who did not code or manage or direct, but who moved among the machinery and sought its pulse from below. The resilience doctrine. In the months that followed, Google rebuilt its internal architecture, not just in terms of data systems, but in terms of responsibility flow. They began creating resilience maps, overlays showing not only server dependencies, but human visibility pathways. The result was unexpected. Not only were emergency responses faster, but trust between departments grew. Engineers began sitting with cleaning crews during lunch breaks. Drivers began reporting interface bugs on their shuttle dashboards. And slowly, a new ethic began to surface, not one of charity or outreach, but of shared ownership. And this time, the media didn't notice. There were no headlines, no think pieces, no viral moments. Only systems, quiet, humble, and prepared. Sundar, looking out his office window one late evening, reflected not on the breach or the boardroom arguments, but on a line from Marcus's letter that had struck him more than anything else. A good gate doesn't keep people out. It teaches everyone when to open it. The gate will remember. 3 years had passed since the day Marcus Walker turned away the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world at a simple security gate. What began as an isolated act of procedural integrity had evolved. Quietly, sometimes painfully, into a seismic cultural movement inside one of the most data-driven organizations on Earth. Not a movement of grand slogans or performance metrics, but of perspective. Not a revolution powered by code, but by character. Now, as another spring unfurled across Silicon Valley, a whisper had begun circulating across Mountain View and beyond. Sundar Pichai might soon step down. The idea at first seemed unbelievable. Sundar had led Google through some of the most turbulent technological and cultural storms of its existence: antitrust investigations, AI transformation, global content battles, and a public reckoning over the soul of leadership. Yet what had most defined his final years was not a product launch or quarterly record. It was a security guard's handshake and the quiet defiance it inspired. He had not chased legacy. He had simply followed conviction, and it had reshaped the walls around him. Now, as the rumors deepened into substance, Sundar spent his days not preparing a farewell speech or orchestrating a handoff in front of cameras, but walking the edges of the company, literally and figuratively. He visited the server farms and data centers, unannounced. He rode the overnight employee shuttles, asking questions, listening to the cadence of the workforce. He sat in on onboarding sessions for new janitorial hires. His presence was never disruptive, just watchful. To some, it was eccentric. To those who understood the story, it was ritual. A leader saying goodbye not to power, but to purpose. Inside his office, he kept no portraits of past summits or awards. Just a photo on his shelf, one not taken for PR, but captured by a young intern with permission. It showed Sundar, not on stage, but sitting beside Marcus on a bench the day of the summit, moments after being denied entry. No audience, no applause, just a conversation, and the beginning of a transformation. That photo, more than any keynote, encapsulated the ethos of everything he'd fought to redefine. Privately, Sundar met with the board and formally signaled his intent to transition out of the CEO role. There was no drama, no leaks. He did not angle for a seat on every advisory board or attempt to craft a grand exit era. Instead, he requested one thing: that the next leader be chosen not solely by shareholder favor or resume prestige, but by witness. He suggested that the internal committee speak with those who had worked beside candidates, not above them or beneath them, but with them. Ask the cafeteria teams, the it-night crew, the front desk, he said. They know who people truly are. At first, the idea was met with amusement, but slowly the board warmed to it. Not because they shared Sundar's style, but because they could not ignore his results. Over the last 3 years, employee attrition had dropped. Innovation had risen. Strangely, not in spite of the empathy program, but because of it. Collaboration was smoother. People spoke more freely. Blind spots were caught sooner. The company had not become slower. It had become wiser. And Sundar's final wish as CEO was not to extend his influence, but to ensure that its roots outlasted his presence. Meanwhile, far from these boardrooms, Marcus Walker had remained a quiet echo in the background. After his brief consulting stint post-crisis, he had returned to his community center work in Oakland, now operating a small mentorship initiative called Gate Ready, a training program that used the values of vigilance, empathy, and dignity to prepare young people for jobs in logistics, security, and frontline operations. The name was, of course, a nod to his own experience, but Marcus never mentioned it to the students. He didn't need to. They knew. What mattered wasn't the story, it was what they became because of it. One evening, Marcus received a simple email, unsigned but unmistakably written in Sundar's style. I will be stepping away soon. The company is stronger, but not perfect. It never will be. But it listens better now. It sees more. And you should know, the new leadership model includes something you once said to me in passing. That trust isn't a badge, it's a habit. That line will be embedded into our cultural guide. I hope you're okay with that. Also, the gate you stood at, where we met, has been renamed. Not with your name, You wouldn't want that. But with your words, there's a plaque there now. Stand your ground, even when no one sees, especially then. Thank you, Marcus. The gate remembers. Marcus read the message twice, then closed his laptop, not with a sense of closure, but with quiet affirmation. He stepped outside his modest office and stood by the center's front door as dusk descended over the city. He watched the young students walk home, some laughing, some dragging their feet, some lost in their phones, but all moving forward. And he thought of Sundar, not as a CEO, not as a titan, but as a man who had listened. The final walk. On Sundar's last official day, there was no grand farewell ceremony, no sprawling company-wide announcement. Instead, he walked alone from one end of the Mountain View campus to the other, starting before sunrise, stopping in each building, not for long, but just long enough to be seen and to say thank you. At the data center, he fist-bumped a technician who once flagged a breach. At the cafe, he shook hands with Louis, still managing the menu with meticulous care. At the shuttle depot, he nodded to the drivers, many of whom had once filed anonymous feedback that reshaped city-wide transit policy. And finally, as golden light stretched across the California morning, he arrived at the gate, the very one where this story began. There, the new security officer on duty looked up, startled to see him walking alone. No badge, no assistant, just a calm smile. For a moment, she seemed unsure, but then she smiled back. "You don't need a badge," she said. "We know who you are." Sundar laughed gently. "That's the first time I've ever heard those words at this gate." She pointed to the plaque installed beside the scanner, the one etched with Marcus's words. "I read it every day," she said. "Makes me feel like I'm part of something bigger." Sundar looked at it, nodded, and whispered almost to himself, "So do I." Then he turned, hands in his pockets, and walked down the path, away from the gate, into the morning, not as a figurehead, but as a man who had once forgotten his badge, and had, in doing so, remembered what it means to lead. The gate closed gently behind him, but it never forgot.